I know the one thing we did right was the day we started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. I know the one thing we did wrong was the day we waited too long. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. Now let me start this off with a little movement trivia. Now let me first tell you how much I love Facing Race 2010. Bust this. My glasses. Now I can't see. I cannot see you. But guess what? I can feel you. Can you feel me? Can you feel me? I can't see, so I really need to feel you this morning. Okay? Let's start this off with a little movement trivia. You're at a protest. How many people been there? Let me know. I can't see you, so shout it out. All right. And somebody asked you the very compelling question, tell me what you want, what you really want. What is the correct answer? Justice. Now, I'm not sure that everybody knows the answer. This is like Family Feud without the feud. Somebody asks you, tell me what you want, what you really want, and you say, justice. Tell me what you want, what you really want. Justice. Tell me what you need, what you really need. Justice. Tell me what you want, what you really want. Justice. Tell me what you need, what you really need. Justice. And the question today is, how do we get it? The question on the table as we hearken back to the past of Jim Crow segregation, and we live in the present of an insidious market racism, structurally defining the conditions and the future of our communities. Today's opening plenary, Facing Race 2010, is about the question of the future. It is about the question of our vision. What can we imagine today that will bring us to the place we need to be tomorrow? In 2030, what will the leaders and organizers, what will our children and their children say about what we did today? Will they say we had a strategy for victory? Will they say that we had the patience and the thoughtfulness to envision a future that was not only beautiful, but also we had the pragmatic strategy to get there? Will they say that? Or will they speak of our rhetoric? Will they speak of our impatience? It's a question. Today we have some beautiful people that are going to come help us answer that question. So first of all, I want to hear some love for the possibility of a future that is better than this one right now, than the present we have today. If you feel it, let me hear it. If you want it, shout it out. Because today, this is our day. This is our day today to define tomorrow. This opening plenary, and again, you're going to have to, please love me right now, because should I use one? The future is now, framing a viable vision for equity. You read the paperwork. I don't need to read off the page to tell you what today's conversation is about. What I do want to do for you, though, is tell you about the incredible leaders that we have coming here to help us try to think through this question of our vision and how we can marry that to our practice. We have Ai-jen Poo, In April 2010, Ai-jen Poo became director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Before I go any further, please give it up for the incredible victories that that alliance has had in the past year. Doing things that people thought could never happen, it happened. Because the future is now, it's possible. Ai-jen Poo has been organizing immigrant women workers in New York since 1996. In 2000, she helped start Domestic Workers United, an organization of nannies, housekeepers, and elderly caregivers in New York, organizing for power, respect, fair labor standards, and to build a powerful social justice movement. We have John Jackson coming to us. Dr. John H. Jackson has been the president and CEO of the Schott Foundation for Public Education since 2000. You know what, and it might be 2000 or something, but it's cut off here. So if it's something else, you know, you can just let them know when you come up here. Dr. Jackson joined the Schott Foundation after several leadership positions at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, baby. Dr. Jackson served on the Obama-Biden transition team as a member of the Presidential Member Education Policy Transition Work Group. Dr. John Jackson, folks. Then we have coming to you, Manuel Pastor. Dr. Manuel Pastor is a professor of geography and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He is the founding director of the Center for Justice, Tolerance, and Community at the University of California, Santa Cruz. The brother currently directs the program for environmental and regional equity at USC and is co-director of the USC Center for the Study of Immigration Integration. Dr. Manuel Pastor. And then coming to the stage, we will have LeeAnn Hall. LeeAnn Hall has been the executive director of the Northwest Federation of Community Organizations, soon to just blossom into some beautiful new thing, since its inception in 1993, and has over 28 years of organizing experience. LeeAnn was the recipient of the prestigious Leadership in a Changing World Award from the Ford Foundation, done a million other things, which, you know, there is no need to go on about that. LeeAnn Hall, people. As I collect my glasses, let me tell you what we need from you. Because this is a conversation. It is the beginning of a longer conversation we're going to have all day, tomorrow, and hopefully into the future, right? Because what? The future is now. So today we're going to ask you, you're going to get some index cards, and we're going to ask you to put your questions for the panelists on these index cards. We're going to have volunteers walking through the audience who are going to collect them. When you have written your question down, all you need to do is raise your hand. I mean like this, put your index card in the air. Let me see you try. You know I can't see you, stop playing. So we are ready to get started. Let me invite our panelists up to the table, all of our panelists. Come on up. And let us begin. And as they come up to the table, let them know that today you are ready for the future. Let them hear you. Let them hear you. I'm ready for the future.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me? Is the mic on? Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
What an honor to address you this morning. Can we have another round of applause, please, for ARC? What an incredible gathering this is. So the image that you see on either side of me that I wanted to share with you this morning is an image of two women from different parts of the world. One from the Philippines and one from Mexico. They're leaders of two different organizations, domestic workers organizations, on opposite sides of the country. They're holding hands here, and it is a symbol of how they're connected and how their connection will be a catalyst for much broader change. They both came to a country which systematically devalued their work as domestic workers. In fact, excluded their entire workforce from almost every major labor law since labor laws were won as part of the New Deal, including the right to organize and form a union. As work that's associated with women's work, domestic work has never been adequately accounted for, protected, or compensated. They came to a country where the legacy of slavery and racism meant that their work would be denied recognition for over 70 years. And both came to this country as a result of changes in the global economy that made it impossible for them to survive in their home countries. They are also both leaders in a growing movement which recently won recognition and protection for over 200,000 of their sisters in the state of New York by passing the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights. And in the coming years, they will win a California Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, protecting an additional over 500,000 workers. So, how many of you know somebody who works as a domestic worker? Okay, so that's quite a few of you. There's 2.5 million domestic workers in this country. So I ask that you think of that person right now, the number of hours she works, the wages she earns, the time off she doesn't get, the job security she wishes she had, the women who work as nannies, housekeepers, and caregivers for the elderly, the vital work that makes all other work possible, are among the most vulnerable workers in the labor force, isolated, excluded, and completely vulnerable to the whim of their employers. At the U.S. Social Forum in Detroit this past June, Maria and Mary Beth, who were in the photo that you saw earlier, and 120 domestic workers from across the country joined together with 300 workers from 9 sectors that are either by design or default excluded from labor laws, including farm workers, guest workers, workers in right-to-work for less states in the South, workfare workers, formerly incarcerated workers, restaurant workers, day laborers, and taxi drivers. Millions, representing millions of workers who fall outside of the current framework for labor law. We call it the Excluded Workers Congress. The room was electric with common stories of vulnerability and exploitation, of resilience and innovations in organizing, despite the exclusion. And what we realized quite powerfully was that domestic workers are not alone. In fact, their own struggles, hopes, and dreams were reflected so powerfully by their brothers and sisters in the Excluded Workers Congress. And they felt that together, they reflected a new labor movement with the potential to develop a powerful vision for a new framework for labor laws in this country. One that directly challenges the racism and sexism at the root of exclusion in the labor laws, and one that works for everyone. Now I ask you to think of another low-wage worker you know, or any worker. Maybe you're having a hard time because so many people you know are out of work. Well, the fact of the matter is that the system that for generations has excluded domestic workers and millions of other workers who I just named is in fact not working for the majority of working people. Most workers today feel unsafe, unprotected, vulnerable. Job loss, wage stagnation, wage theft is common, more and more common every day. Not just for excluded workers or informal sector workers or the underground economy, but for so many of us. Now I'm going to ask you to think of someone who you know was part of an effort to organize a union in their workplace. Think of what that was like, how it felt, what they were up against, and what they had to risk in order to form a union. And it starts to feel pretty clear that in this country, we do not have the human right to organize. The right to form a union and collectively bargain is not a human right in practice, even for those workers for whom the National Labor Relations Act was created. This picture is from the march at the US Social Forum, where we as a domestic workers movement committed to building a new vision for labor laws and the human right to organize that is rooted in human rights, racial and gender justice. In fact, we're talking about rooting the right to organize in the 13th Amendment, because we know as domestic workers that when you don't have the right to organize, you are essentially vulnerable to indentured servitude. Next week, the Excluded Workers Congress will be meeting in Washington, and we will be joined by our brothers and sisters in the union movement to discuss and develop this vision, along with other concrete ideas for how we can work together toward a better life for all working people, all of us together, a labor movement for the 21st century, where Maria and Mary Beth's experiences and leadership are not only visible, but help chart a new future for all of us. And this is but one of many powerful examples of how understanding and facing race and gender and bringing forward the leadership of workers and women of color can help create new paths to power and positive social change for everyone.
Good morning. Well, you all start off bright, early, and strong. I'm not singing. And it's a pleasure to be back here, my hometown, Chicago, South Side, 95th and Jeffrey. Give it up for the South Side. Again, my name is John Jackson, president of the Schott Foundation for Public Education. And Schott is a place where we believe that all students, regardless of race or ethnicity, deserve a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. Unfortunately, that is not the case in our country today. In our country today, education is divided by zip code. Education is divided by race or ethnicity. We're able to identify by race who's more likely to graduate, who's more likely to drop out, who's less likely to be in gifted and talented courses, and there's no way that that should be in our country today. A couple of weeks ago, the Schott Foundation published a report on the performance of black males in public education. And we focused on black males simply because we care about all students receiving an opportunity to learn. And we don't measure that by those who are just at the top, but we want to understand the conditions for those who are at the bottom. And in 30 of the 50 states, black males were at the bottom. And another 10 states, Latino males were at the bottom. And in the 30 states where black males were at the bottom, Latino males were second to the bottom. So we have an issue in the way that we're providing opportunities to learn to black and Latino males across this country. Now, the major challenge is we are at a point in our history where our country can't be globally competitive without addressing this equity issue. The president has said that if we are going to be globally competitive in the 21st century, we have to be a global leader in college attainment by 2020. How many of you all know that in order to do that, we need 23 million more graduates than our current rate? 23 million. That means that this country does not get there without graduating more black, brown, native, Hmong students across the country. So the answer to this has been a few education programs that are designed to only educate a few. Race to the top, a competition. At a time when all of the states are challenged, we have our states in a competition identifying winners or losers. How many of you all know if California loses, the country is a loser? If New York loses, the country is a loser. So we don't need a race at this time. We need a common agenda to lift all states, all students to create one America. And the Opportunity to Learn campaign is about that. We believe that it's based on three important values: that all students deserve an opportunity to learn as a matter of right. both a human and civil right. Now, it's not just enough to say that, but we have to operationalize that. What does that mean? We know what works, that all students deserve access to early childhood education, ensuring that they're literate by 3rd grade. That all students should have a highly effective teacher, and those teachers should be supported. How many teachers do we have in the room? Let's give it up for the teachers. Give it up. We can do better than that. If we were cheering for the Chicago Bears, the Pittsburgh Steelers, what have you, we could do better than that. Our teachers are under attack. Why? Because we know that there's a resource equity issue, but legislators don't want to criticize themselves, so they don't want to legislate themselves. It's hard and more difficult to legislate parenting in some situations, so the only people that we will blame are teachers. Students are coming into the classroom with challenges that teachers need the support to address. And our teachers are very important. God knows we need to have teachers because there are no laws to mandate seeing preachers, so someone has to teach them. And in many respects, our teachers are serving a gap. You know, I've had the opportunity to go to law school, University of Illinois here, and get my doctorate at Harvard, but I know that it was a teacher who made the difference. I remember I finished high school with a 2.5 on a 5-point scale. And I remember being in an English class, and I wasn't doing well. The teacher was putting me out until one day I was walking down the hall, and I was rapping. Said, I've been in this game for years. It's made me an animal. There's rules to this stuff, so I wrote me a manual, a step-by-step booklet. My teacher saw that. He said, come here. He said, if you can remember that, you can remember that no man is an island entire of himself, but every man is a piece of a continent, a part of the main. Thus any man's death diminishes us, for we are involved in mankind. Therefore never sin to know from whom the bell tolls. That teacher knew that I could understand the content of information, and it was a matter of drawing a bridge between what I respected and knew and what he wanted me to understand. That is the art of teaching. And we've got to support our teachers in that particular art. We've got to ensure that all students have access to college and career preparatory curricula. It's not an issue of saying, well, should every child go to college? There will be some that may not choose, but every child should have the opportunity to choose. It's the fact that you get to 11th grade and 12th grade, and many of our children don't have the opportunity to choose. And if our children are in educational institutions and they're not being educated, they're just being institutionalized. And that's what we're seeing across the country. And finally, we want to make sure that we are receiving equitable resources. And it's not just about more money, but targeting the money on what we know works. And in all of our states, we have this issue where the resources are not being equitably distributed. And we've got to call governors and legislators and others to task in order to protect the right for all students to learn, because it is a civil right. And in many respects, I said last night that we're back to a place that we were some 50 years ago. You know, in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas, there was a scene where Daisy Bates was desegregating Central High School. And she had allowed pushed through the mob and allowed the Little Rock 9 to enter the school, 9 black kids to enter the school. And there was an angry mob outside. And the people inside was fearful that the mob would get the children. And they asked the question, well, maybe if we give them one of the children, they'll let the others out. It broke down because they couldn't decide which child to sacrifice. I feel in many respects today we're in the same situation. There are those who will say, well, we recognize that there are a sea of challenges, but if we provide them a few schools to educate a few, they'll forget about the others that are suffering. We cannot accept that. We've got to develop a plan that provides all students an opportunity to learn. And I know that we have a sea of challenges, and each of us, sometimes it seems too large for us to address, but we all have a ship, we all have a voice. if we're willing to say that I'm tired of keeping my little boat safe inside the harbor's bar. I want to go out where the big ships float, out on the deep where the great ones are. And if my frail craft proves too slight for waves that sweep the billows o'er, I'd rather go out in a stirring fight than drowse to death than a sheltered shore. That's the commitment that we have to make. And as I take my seat, I just want to remind us of something that a little boy had to teach his father. The father was reading the story to the little boy, and the little boy asked, after the father completed the story and kissed him, said, "Daddy, can I have a glass of water?" Father said, "Son, it's your bedtime. Go to bed. You should have asked earlier. Good night." Father gets up, begins to walk out again. "Daddy, can I have a glass of water?" Father, a little more perturbed because it's bedtime. "I just read you the story, son. It's time to go to bed. You're not getting the water. Hey, if I have to come back in here, I'm going to spank you. Go to bed." Father gets back up, walks out the door, closes the door. Son says, "Daddy, when you come back in here to spank me, can you bring me a glass of water?" We have to have a level of persistence for this charge, because that's the only way that we're going to ensure that all children have an opportunity to learn. God bless you all.
You know, following these speakers this morning reminds me of during the first Iraq War. I was asked to speak at a conference at Fairfax High in Los Angeles and talk about the economics of the war. And before I got up, they said, "But we have a speaker that's up before you," and it turned out it was Ed Asner, the famous actor. And instead of speaking, he actually acted the scene, and people were crying, and it was very dramatic. And I thought I was about to get up, and then they said, "But no, now we have a special guest," and it was Maxine Waters. And Maxine had just been elected, and her first big vote in Congress was going to be against the Iraq War. And she got up and she just gave this fiery speech, and I was just feeling very frightened at the end. And she said, "And I have a special guest, Jesse Jackson." And then Jesse got up and he gave a speech, and when they were done, they introduced me, and I went walking across the lonely stage as the economist Manuel Pastor. Several of my students were there. What a marvelous group of speakers, and what a marvelous conference. And let's bring up the picture that we were supposed to, we were all supposed to have a picture. And this is the picture. And we're supposed to talk about our vision, how we get there, the role of racial equity, how to bring peace to the Mideast. And this picture is what I would call a declaration of solidarity. And it's a statement that we stand with each other. And I want to talk about each other, with, and stand in that order. Now, the each other bit is about how we're changing as a nation. And many of you know, it's often repeated, that by 2042 or sometime thereafter we'll be a majority minority, or as I like to think of it, all minority all the time, nation. By 2023, the majority of people under the age of 18 will be people of color, and sometime either this year or next, the majority of births will be to people of color, which means probably some of you have been busy in the audience. But one of the things I think that's very important about this is that we tend to think that, my gosh, that demography is destiny. But in fact, we need to be quite intentional about building the alliances. Because just because the demography is changing does not mean the politics will change in terms of the consciousness of our own people or in terms of the bridges that we need to build. Now, when we build those bridges, we need to be paying attention to building them at the grassroots in an honest way. You know, I was an early part of the campaign in Los Angeles, led by Scope and the Apollo Alliance, to do a green retrofit ordinance. And the first meeting of that actually was Karen Bass, the State Assembly Speaker, African-American woman, and I actually having a meeting in South LA about the history of South LA, its deindustrialization, and black-brown relations in that context. And, you know, we have a lot of those kind of black-brown conversations at the university, and they're often quite polite. Having them in South LA was great because, you know, Karen and I got and we spoke, and then the first question somebody raised their hand and said, "You know, I used to like Mexicans. I just don't like these new Mexicans," right? And But, you know, we kept in that dialogue. And one of the things I think we need to do is to move beyond the comfort level that we normally have and get to the grassroots where there are lots of concerns, angers, and prejudices, and help move people through this. So we need to have a different kind of intentional conversation to bring people together. And then when we bring people together, we have to learn how we stand not just with each other, but for each other. One of the things, for example, around the issue of immigration is that there's been a lot of us working in the immigrant rights movement asking the question, how can we bring African Americans into that movement? But the other important question is, how can we get immigrants to stand up for what are the central concerns of African Americans in this country? We need to stand for and with each other. And apparently, judging from these signs, we need to talk a lot quicker, too. So the second thing I want to say is about the with part, and I just talked a little bit about this, and this is the solidarity. We need to be with each other, and part of that means that we need to think about how we build a new economy that works for everyone. We need to recraft the narrative of what just went wrong in this country. The way I've been thinking about it is as follows. We became extraordinarily unequal. We became so unequal that one group of people had so much money they were forced to speculate in the stock market, and another group of people was so strapped financially they kept borrowing just to stay alive. That inequality was played out through a deregulated market, so the wealthy bought derivatives and low-income folks were stuck with subprime loans in places soon to be foreclosed. And we were so disconnected as a nation that when the first people to lose their homes were Black and Latino householders living in the hinterlands and suburbs, that we said, oh, that's not going to happen to me. We were so unequal, so deregulated, and so disconnected that we got into this crisis. And the only way we're going to get out is if we're reconnected, re-regulated, and begin to pay attention to making equity the central way that we generate economic growth. But that puts something on us as progressives too, which means that it's not just enough to argue for redistribution. We need to figure out, as John was talking about, how we make education and empowerment of our people the economic drivers of the future. We need to have a theory of the economy. We need to have our own economic strategy, or we're going to continue to be battered by economic strategies that come up from others. Now, the last point, because I have 1 minute, which is great, if you could bring the picture back up a second. So, the standing part. You know, there is a tendency when we think about the future to think about it, this 2030, as nirvana, right? We got to stasis. We won, right? And basically history ended, and now it's all good. But it's really just a continuing protest, and the great tradition of this country is of social movements making change through protest. I don't know about you, but I didn't know, and I'm maybe one of the older people on the panel, that 35 years ago I'd be here thinking that marriage equality was central to our struggle for liberation. And I don't know what protest I'll be attending in 20 years when I'm 54. But I am absolutely sure there's going to be some fucked up shit that I'm going to have to be tackling. We will always be standing up. We will always be protesting. We will always be part of a social movement, because that is what gives us identity. That's what leads us to bond with each other. And that's what really drives America to its better angels and its promise. Thank you.
I also want to thank ARC for being here and to be joined on stage, or to join people on stage who have done some great work here. My picture, is it up? Has three basic elements for the future, I think. It involves, as Manuel said, a vibrant movement. I don't think the movement is now for a future that is different, but we need to stay strong. It includes quality, accessible healthcare system that addresses the long-standing health inequities. It includes good housing, jobs, transportation, and food, all necessary for keeping us healthy. So the story that I want to share is one that has inspired me over the past year, and that's about Marcellus Owens. You can see him high-fiving with the president right there. Marcellus Owens is a third-generation member of Washington Community Action Network. Marcellus is known, some people join him in this crowd, is known for his vigilance and truth-telling to others about staying on message. He often is a person giving feedback to that training that many of us have gone to, rat bites baby exercise, and he's a person telling us whether we're on message or not, and he is ruthless. Marcellus is 11 years old and has the courage to stand up and speak truth to power. In the dark days of healthcare reform, when we thought we didn't know what was going to happen, whether there would even be a bill, Marcellus began to tell his story. He told a story about how his mother, only 27 years old, died an early death because she did not have any healthcare reform. He told it simply, directly, and in a way that was incredibly moving, the simple truth of his story. He told it over and over again, and the right wing responded. They responded with ugly, ugly attacks. Glenn Beck said, "It's unseemly and exploitative, an 11-year-old kid being forced to tell his story. Democrats are willing to use kiddie shields." And Marcellus had the courage to stand up to the right wing with the kind of dignity and simplicity that I wish all of us could embrace. He responded by looking the cameras right in the eye and simply saying, "My mother told me that everybody has a right to an opinion. It just doesn't mean that they're right." And he'd stop talking. Yes, to Marcellus. So over this past year, as I've been in and out of rooms with Marcellus, we've been talking, as those in the organizing world do, about the future and what people want and where they're at. And Marcellus's vision also inspires me. He talks about wanting his younger sisters to get a good education. He wants to support his family with a good job. Right now, what he's doing is making money washing cars. He has career aspirations that today include being the President of the United States. Or a musician. That doesn't work out. And he wants to make sure that he has access to a basketball court where he can play his favorite sport. But also, he cares that if someone gets sick or hurt, that they get to go to a doctor that they know and that knows them and their family. That they won't have to wait in line or for 3 months, you know, that they get in right away. And that the doctors and the nurses and the health professionals know how to talk to you. They don't make you feel bad. They speak to you in your own language. And that when you head out the door, you have what it takes to get well. You have the medicine, you have access to the, I'm being told to stand closer. To get the medicine that you need. And most important, you don't have to pay for it, right? That whatever you need, you have access to. And so as I listen to Marcellus' story, I know that race matters in this story. To advance, we need to simply understand and address the role that race plays in the story. Tiffany, Marcellus' mother, was working hard at Jack in the Box for low wages, without paid sick days, and with minimal coverage. She got sick and lost her job and what little coverage she had. She couldn't access health care that she needed, and she died at 27 years old, leaving 3 children to be raised by their grandmother. Together, we are building a movement to address these inequities and to fight for quality education, good jobs, housing, good food, clean air, clean water, and quality care for any of us who happen to get sick. Thank you.
With two reminders, I am here to announce to you, if you need a card for the question and answer period, please raise your hand and somebody's going to get you one. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask the panelists, raise your hand, okay? And someone will get you an index card. But before you do that, can we give the panelists some love? A lot more love. What does it take to build a vision? What does it mean to come to the table with questions about the measure of equity in our schools? A conversation about how demographic shifts may or may not lead to political power. And what do we need to do in order to build the kind of political power we need to make the changes that we deserve? How do we transform our national identity? How do we build the power to gain the human right to organize, create safe, living wage jobs for all people? How do we lift all boats at the same time? There are ways to do this. There are questions that need to be answered, but there are answers. And our panelists are here to help us think through what some of those answers may be. So without further ado, please raise your hand. If you have a question, someone will bring you over. And remember that I can't see you. So, excellent, wonderful. Can you hear me? I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So as we have folks coming around to bring you index cards and then collecting your question, which again, when your question is written, please raise up your hand again and someone will collect your card and bring it up to the front. But in the meantime, let's begin with a conversation. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. All right. So, you know, as we think about the universe of public policies that need to be moved in order to move the kinds of agendas we've been talking about here today, if we could begin by answering the question a little bit, what is the role, what do we need to do about corporate power in the midst of our public policy agenda? How do we, you know, we have some thoughts about how we deal at the public policy level. How do we deal with corporate power in that universe? And if we could just take a brief answer from each one of the panelists, that would be great. You mind starting with you, Sid?
Sure. I think we've got to put up a fight. We've got to do a really strong fight back against the consolidation of corporate power. And I think that what that means is that we've got to do what we've been doing, but to scale. And we've got to build a movement in this country that cuts across communities, organizations, regions, that represents millions and millions more people who can actually take to the streets, do the kind of protest actions that Manuel talked about, reflect a broader vision that's a long-term vision, the kind of movement that LeeAnn talked about. We've got to continue to build the social force on the ground that can really pose a real challenge to the kind of corporate power that we've seen. So I think that it's similar to what we do around public policy. In order to see any real progressive change in this country, we've got to build a social force on the ground in communities that's connected and strategic and moving and directing energy together. And we've got to direct it at some of that corporate power that you've been talking about.
Excellent, right on.
So, you know, the question reminds me of something that was said once about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which is that he dragged capitalists kicking and screaming to their own salvation, right? By rescuing essentially the financial system and the economic system of the time. And I think while there are challenges to corporate power that need to be made, another thing that we really need to bring forward is the fact that this inequality is actually bad for economic growth and economic sustainability over time. You know, there's a body of international literature that shows that the more equal a nation is, in fact, the more rapid growth it has. And in fact, over the last couple of years, some colleagues and I have been doing research on metropolitan regions in the United States, and regions that are, and including the Federal Reserve doing this research, finding out that regions that are more equal, less residentially segregated, spread more opportunity, in fact have more sustainable economic growth over time. Now, it may have been in the past that somehow exploiting a group of people and having a gigantic reserve army of the unemployed somehow made sense for the system. But as John is pointing out, when you are leaving so many people behind in what is a competitive economy, you really can't get ahead. So the fact that we're underinvesting in our youth, the fact that we have such fractious politics, it all means we can't grow together. So as much as we need to challenge corporate power, and that's important, we need to challenge the corporate message that somehow this inequality is good for economic growth, and that addressing the inequality is somehow liberal do-gooderism. It is not. It is essential to our economic survival.
I think absolutely. I'll stay on that point. You know, during the Depression era, Herbert Hoover decided that the federal government was not going to really address the issue. They would leave it up to the localities. And the unemployment rate ballooned from 8% to 23%. And FDR came in with a vision to provide some level of regulation and balance, and that's what moved us out of the Depression and changed the trajectory of our country. I think the federal government has to go back and require our corporations to be a part of the equity agenda or an opportunity agenda. Not just opportunity for themselves, but opportunity for America and the people. Right now, corporations are holding on to more cash than they did the last 5 years. So even with all of the tax cuts, and they're not investing it in hiring people, they're saving and holding on to the cash. That has to stop. But this value of corporate responsibility, we just can't look at it as it relates to the large corporation. It has to also be a value in the local communities. We talk about an opportunity to learn state. We want opportunity to learn businesses also. And to the degree that there are businesses in your community, whether they be a corner store or a liquor store, who are deriving revenue from the citizens of your community, and you can't support Little League, you can't keep a mentoring program in your community, that's a parasitic business. And that business has to be called to task to value and provide some balance in supporting that community. And I think that's a value that has to be pushed both at the local level, the state level, and across the country.
So I want to end by talking about, I think, something that's making people in the neighborhoods that I'm in really angry, and that is the role that banks are playing in the financial institutions. People know that they can't make ends meet, that they're having a hard time paying the mortgage, and if they can pay it, that oftentimes the house that they're living in isn't worth the payment that they're making to the bank. And they're pissed off at the banks and the financial institutions for literally draining their own pockets, their own personal wealth, which has a lot to do with racial inequity in this country right now, as you see the wealth gap increasing. But also, they're really concerned about what steps they need to take to a better future and how this problem connects to the public budgets. So it's not only that the banks and the financial institutions are taking it away from us as individuals, we're giving it back to them in our taxes. They're not paying taxes. They're doing these debt swaps with city and county governments and draining the public coffers over and over again. We need to continue to build the movement and tap into the anger that everyday people are feeling in relationship to the big banks and the financial institutions, and bring that feeling and anger onto the streets.
Right on, thank you. So, you know, as we consider this question, this question about, direct confrontation of corporate power, equity-driven economies, dealing with parasitic businesses and transforming them into a mutual beneficial relationship, and really targeting the financial institutions and practices that are actually shaping racism today. As we do that, as we consider those questions, we have a question from the audience. In that context, how do you suggest we step up the pressure on the Obama administration to deal with race issues more effectively? So, and I'll take answers from any of the panelists. We don't need everybody, but who'd like to take that? How about, can you start us off?
Thank you for the easy question.
I got your back.
Yeah, you got my back. That's good. That's good. Let's give a round of applause for her, actually, because some of you may know that she's stepping in at the last minute, but also her ability to just synthesize what we all said and actually make it sound like one program. It's all good. You're our leader. So, I mean, I think, you know, two things. One serious and then one not so serious, which is that, you know, we have to understand the inside-outside game that we need to play with the Obama administration. You know, I do think that there were some of us who may have thought, God, this is great, this guy got elected, he's a community organizer, the revolution has arrived, right? And yet this is a person who's a politician and who faces all sorts of constraints. And it reminds me again of the Great Depression when labor leaders went to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and said that he should fight for the Wagner Act, and he said, okay, great, you've convinced me, now make me do it. And the question is, how do we make the Obama administration do this? And it's really going to take the kind of social movement organizing and pressure that's going to try to make sure that they stay honest to this message. There are some really interesting opportunities within the administration. They're often somewhat in the niches around housing and urban development, stuff around regional equity, etc. But we need to take advantage of those opportunities, and we also need to push hard with organizing where those opportunities, where we need to move the dialogue along. I would also suggest that we require that the Obama administration purchase purchase new mics maybe, but purchase a copy of my new book with Angela Glover Blackwell and Stuart Coe called Uncommon Common Ground, Race in America's Future. I mention this because Chris Rabb got a good, you know, rap about his book earlier, and I was a little resentful. And the book's not actually out in there, so you have to buy it yourself. I think Rinku said you should buy it and then read it. You don't even have to read my book, just buy it. And for those of you who are not readers, it's going to be made into a major motion picture soon. I was going to be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. I was very excited. Now it's Carlos Mencia, but I'm still excited. So, but again, I think it's really an inside-outside game, and we saw that happen around the healthcare reform, and maybe LeeAnn would talk a bit about that.
Yeah, well, on healthcare reform, as you all know, there were many ups and downs in our fight for healthcare reform, and we really had to not only call the president out, but call the leadership in Congress out to stand with people over and over and over again. And we had to build up consistently the pressure on the streets to be able to do it. There were always backroom conversations, but we had to be willing to separate ourselves from the mainstream dialogue about healthcare reform and ask for more and show the need for more and be persistent and not give up to get to the finish line. And I think that we're all a little squeamish about doing that, wanting to support the president on one hand, but on the other hand, really being true to our agenda and really needing to move that and to speak, as Marcellus did, the truth to power. So it was really important to be willing to separate ourselves from not only the president, but key Democrats to ask for more and to keep the fight alive.
I think we have to identify those areas where we can applaud what the administration is doing, because the fourth branch of government is not going to do it. The media, I never have heard them say the president actually did a great job on X, Y, and Z. We're always looking for the dissension that can push a story, but also in those areas where the president is dead wrong, we love the person, we hate the policy. And I talked about that a little in education. You know, with this race to the top, they've said that there will be winners or losers. Now that's a more conservative theory than the previous administration that had the aspiration of leaving no child behind. Even though they didn't put the money behind it, the aspiration was there. This administration said there will be winners or losers. We will leave some behind. Now we've got to call that to task. and speak truth to power, not just for ourselves, but for our children. Because how will our children know how to test a lie if we never tell them the truth? And regardless of who the president is, we've got to show them that we care about the opportunities that they have. And I believe there were a number of civil rights organizations who presented a document to the president, a framework on education. They offered some recommendations on how to provide all students an opportunity to learn. The president's response was, well, there's some civil rights organizations who want to go back to the status quo. No, the status quo for over 100 years is providing inequitable resources for our schools. The status quo in black and brown communities is closing schools. They're more likely to have teachers fired, principals fired, schools closed and reopened. That's not new. That's just rebranding the same thing. Let's try something new, investing in our schools, keeping our schools open, creating our schools as networks and change agents for our communities. That's what we have to articulate to the president.
So I would really agree with everything that folks have already said, and just to lift up a few pieces of that, the importance of building an independent social movement, and at the end of the day, the power that we build will be reflected, right? And the piece about really marking where the administration is doing well and where there's progress, and it's meaningful progress. And so places like the Department of Labor, there actually has been really meaningful progress, and the Secretary of Labor has actually made it a focus to work with vulnerable workers, worker centers, organizers on the ground to try to figure out how we really enforce labor laws in this country. And that hasn't happened for years. And so that's really important. At the same time, there's more deportations now under the Obama administration than there were under the Bush administration. And that's also got to be pointed out and called out. And so I think that at the end of the day, we've got to just build the social movement that's independent, that has a voice, that says this is right and that says this is wrong.
So we have a question here that asks, the engine of the civil rights movement was protest and boycott. In this context of economic crisis and political opportunity, has that engine become obsolete? And if so, what works now? Thoughts from the panel. What works? If not protest and boycott, then what?
I think the engine, a part of that engine was strategy also. So it wasn't just a matter of them going to the streets and protesting, but they were very strategic about when and what they wanted the nation to see. Part of the strategy was to show the nation how, and the international community at a time when we were trying to move democracy, what America was doing to children. They were sicking dogs and water hose on children. And so their direct action had purpose, and then through that they could message it. I think we've got to connect direct action with our messaging in a way to provide us a platform to move our agenda. So, you know, that's one of the things. And it wasn't just a black or brown movement, but the strategy covered many areas. There were a number of groups marching, and I think we've got to get back to that level of collaboration and that level of strategy and discipline.
And just to also put another spin on the question, you know, is it an appropriate assumption to assume that that engine of protest and boycott has become obsolete? So that's also, I think, part of the question. Is it actually obsolete? And then if so, what else, right? So,
you know, I definitely don't think protest and boycott are obsolete, but I want to lift up a point that John was making in a slightly different way. And you may recall our friend Van Jones, who had a brief stint in the White House, and he had this great statement once that Martin Luther King didn't say, "I have an issue." He said, "I have a dream," right? And I think that part of where we really have to put something on ourselves. You know, one of the formative experiences for me thinking about political and organizing work was being in Los Angeles in the wake of the Los Angeles civil unrest, in which you know, progressive organizations basically had to look at themselves and say, if we've got a group of people in the city pissed off enough to burn down their own city, but we haven't been able to channel that into progressive social change. There may be something wrong with the system, but there's also something wrong with us, right? And out of that, in LA, came a whole new era of multicultural organizing, new framing around working poverty, and bringing together different kinds of communities for really a new vision. I think part of the work of a conference like this is to say, what is our vision that's really, and what is our dream that's really going to move us forward? The other thing I would say about that, and it really comes from the earlier stuff, is to realize that when we talk about collaboration and working together, sometimes there's a notion that that's like that ride in Disneyland, It's a Small World After All, where, you know, you're going down and there's all those little children from all different places and they're all waving and singing. Collaboration is not frequently like that, you may have noticed. And I describe it much more as principled conflict, right? It's staying in a relationship with people as you move forward, because you've got some principles that you're going to work on together, and you've got the principle that you're in it together. So the black-brown dialogue is not an easy thing where you're going to have one conversation and people go, oh my God, now I understand the civil rights history, or now I understand what it means to be undocumented. It's a tough and ongoing kind of conversation. So how do we have the principled conflict, and how do we have a vision that really animates us as we move forward?
So here we are, because I know we're coming to the close of this plenary. But here we are in a conversation about authentic relationships, about principled conflict, about strategy, and about vision. In that context, thinking about that, we have a question here. Given the vitriolic, anti-government rhetoric of the Tea Party right and the rising deficits of state budgets, how do we build a discourse and a strategy around the public or common good? And I want to actually pose that question to LeeAnn.
Thank you.
Because I love your mind.
Well, I think this is a question before all of us, right? How do we change the story that is told over and over again that government, big government, is at the center of our problems? And I think that one thing we need to do is go back to that question about big corporations. We need to put the spotlight on the role that corporations are playing in America, and we need to be able to tell a coherent story about how corporations are making decisions every day that impact our lives, our everyday lives. They impact the ability for government to deliver quality services and our ability to move forward together. And it brings me back to the earlier question about boycotts and protests. And I think that one thing that happens today is that people want instant gratification. They want to do that 5,000 or 10,000 or 50,000 person march, and then they think they've made the statement that's going to answer the question. And what we have to know is that it's not going to be one event, whether it's a boycott or a march or anything else. It's going to be the consistent drumbeat of our ideas breaking through the right-wing frame through our direct action, through our street heat, through our messaging, through our visionary young spokespeople that are out there reframing a direction and a dream for us to move forward to into the next century.
And so there is a conversation to be had about the power of narrative organizing. And a conversation to be had about stories that we don't need to just get it done, but we also need to get it felt. So the question that we're going to close this conversation with, what advice do you give to someone young, relatively, apparently, like myself, and passionate about racial harmony, when surrounded by leaders, political, social, and spiritual, who are afraid of having a dialogue beyond rhetoric? How do we move beyond the rhetorical conversations into the nuanced, complex, deep, authentic dialogues, fights, and confrontations that we need in order to win? And I'm going to pose that question to Ai-jen. Make it happen.
Well, I would say the quote, there's a famous quote by Maya Angelou that people don't remember what you say, they remember how you make them feel. And how do we create an environment and a movement and a force for social change that everyone feels their hopes and dreams reflected in? And I think that bringing a racial justice and also a gender justice lens actually helps us think about that. The other thing I would say is that there's another quote, and I don't know who said this, but the difference between reform work and justice work is that justice work expands the realm of what's possible. And how are we always pushing the envelope in every situation that we're in? How do we seek to expand the realm of what's possible in the service of our vision for a better future?
And so, as we close out this plenary, first of all, I'm feeling deeply right now. I'm feeling passionately right now, and I'm hopeful that this is what you're feeling as well, and that we leave this conversation with the capacity to dream that has been expanded. So we're going to go around one time and have each panelist kind of give a closing remark, and then we'll wrap up with a question.
Well, I guess my closing is about really the honor it is to be in this room, to be to have the ability to every day spend building a movement, meeting with people who have very difficult lives, but take the time out to think about a better future for themselves, their family, and the whole country. And that people really aspire to a different kind of way of relating. They really want to invest in that. There are difficult conversations on that journey, but that's the journey that I'm committed to and feel happy to be in the room with everyone else.
I think one of the things that we really have to look at again is our strategy, and goes beyond just what we talked about, marches. I mean, there have been a million man march, a million family march, a million squirrel march, and I think we're becoming desensitized to, so we've got to get back to the strategy. And let's not forget to do what those who came before us in the movement did. They visioned new structures. We may have, just talking to Cassie yesterday, we may have outlived this two-party system. In that there's not a party that represents the opportunity for the people. Now, the Tea Party would say that they do, but I always ask them, where was the tea when the people were thirsting in Katrina? Where was the tea when millions of people were losing their job? Why wasn't the tea brewing when there were situations where people were losing educational opportunity? So it's not about opportunity there, it's about fear. There needs to be a party that represents opportunity, because as I look at the two parties, while oil was dripping and gushing in the Gulf Coast, they didn't want to pass an environmental law. While we have problems and unconstitutional laws in Arizona, they don't want to touch immigrations. While we have economic challenges, I just read yesterday, they don't want to touch tax cuts before the election. So it seems like the party system that we have set up right now is only concerned about being reelected, both Democrat and Republican, and there needs to be a party that represents the opportunity of the people.
I kind of missed that squirrel march, so I'm really hoping I can get to that the next time. So I want to kind of loop back to a question that was asked earlier and close, and it's about the Tea Party. And I think that we have a notion, and it's correct, that what that represents is the last gasp of white supremacy in some important ways. And I think that's part of the analysis. But I think the other part of it is that this represents a group of people who themselves feel very lost and very confused and very insecure, partly because of the demographic change sweeping the country, and that makes them feel insecure, and it makes us angry at them for that reason. But also they feel as dislocated by this economy and as left out as many of us, right? And one of the things that you know as an organizer is that you try to go where people are, try to figure out what is really hurting and driving them, and try to pull them to their better selves, right? And one of the things I want to urge us to do is to not give up. I mean, I just, you know, when I think of Glenn Beck, I keep thinking someday that guy's head's just going to blow off, right? You know? And I'm hoping, right? But But I want us to not give up on trying to figure out how we make that communication and how we make that soulful communication to those that we can pull over, as Aijin was saying earlier. And the reason why is, think about it. You did not get into this work because you read some Marxist tract in college. Actually, probably some of you did, but you read some Marxist tract in college. Man, that's a smarter strategy, right? You got into this work because you felt that, you know, it spoke to you, maybe your own sense of pain and dislocation and loss, but also it spoke to you about your identity and your strength and the way that you could come together with people to change the world and make it a better world. You are here for spiritual and emotional and moral reasons. And if we lift those things up, we can do the kind of organizing that Aijin's talking about and reach across to some people who we now are putting aside and not realizing that they too are hurting. And how we bring them into our camp is really a central task for the next couple of years.
So, the last word. Well, I'm going to give it to a colleague of mine, Pablo Alvarado, from the National Day Labor Organizing Network. When the governor, when the governor of Arizona signed SB 1070 into law, there was a lot of responses, a lot of anger, a lot of fear in the community, a lot of emotion. And what he said was that between fear and anger, there's courage. And he talked about the courage that he saw in the communities in Arizona, the courage of everyday people who came together, who took to the streets, 900,000 strong, right? Day after day, week after week, in a sustained campaign to turn the tide on that legislation. And I think that that's the glimpse of what it is that we've got to do going forward. We've got to have the courage to build real power for the long term, for the long haul, because it's a marathon.
As we wrap up, will you stand with me? Yes, ma'am. Will you stand with me? Pleasure. Today we heard about dreams. We heard about what the future could be. We heard about the fact that building a platform and an agenda and a strategy and a vision for racial equity is also about building a platform and a strategy and a vision for economic equity. It lifts us all at once. As we move from this plenary out into the rest of the conference, as we deal with the question of what it means to face race in this moment, in this time, let us not forget that this moment is about the next one. That the future is when? Now. When is the future? Now. And the future belongs to the people here, the people who could not be here because they're incarcerated, because they were deported, because they are poor, because they are dead, because they had no health care insurance. We are here in representation, but also in solidarity, because the future is now. It belongs to us all. And what I want you to do is I want you to say this. I want you to shout out dream. Dream. I want you to shout out vision. Vision. I want you to shout out hope. Hope. And I want you to shout out change. Change. Because this is what we're here to do. We're here because we are the dreamers. We're here because we are offering not fear, not division, not wedges, but we are offering hope for the future. We are here because we have a vision. We are here because we know that our vision can become reality. Please give it up for yourselves and for our panel.
Pleasure to meet you.